The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass. If you would like this program to continue, please be ready to pledge financial support when you are asked later in the program.
What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. One of the hard sayings of the Gospels. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. You know, there are many who say that Vatican II, nothing essential has been changed. After watching this program, if you still believe that, then you probably believe in the Tooth Fairy. There were 388 annulments in 1968. By 1988, the figure was 50,000, a 15,000% increase. If that doesn't reflect an essential doctrinal change, then nothing does. With us to discuss marriage, divorce, and annulments are three priests who say the traditional Latin Mass exclusively and reject the Second Vatican Council and the new religion which it generated. Father Donald Sanborn is pastor of St. Pius X Church in Warren, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. Father Clarence Kelly is spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate, Congregation of Traditional Catholic Sisters. And Father Thomas Marachka is pastor of St. Anne Church in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. You know, I think what a growing scandal, which is even being recognized by the secular press, is the situation with annulments. How do you explain 388 annulments in 1968 and 50,000 in 1988?
Well, it's due to a complete reversal of the attitude toward marriage. You know that annulments always existed in the Catholic Church. Henry VIII asked for an annulment. And they were granted, but they were granted very rarely and very, very carefully and according to very strict principles. An annulment is a declaration by the Church itself that a marriage has not taken place because of certain essential defects and very specific defects. And in order to make such a declaration, there has to be, in the traditional view and practice of the Church, a very thorough investigation, something like in fact, a trial. A trial of the whole case with witnesses and oaths, and a review by a number of judges, and then it would go to Rome and they would review it. It was a very, very careful process, and if somebody received an annulment, I remember when I was a child, it was a very rare thing. It was, you would not, there would be a few people in the whole diocese that ever received an annulment because of the respect that the Church had for the words of Christ, that what God hath put together, let no man put asunder. And that you cannot simply break people apart for no reason, that you have to have, in order to declare an annulment, a real reason that there was some intrinsic problem, either lack of true consent or mistaken identity or grave fear, somebody with a shotgun to his head or something like that, and that it was proved. Now you can get an annulment for anything. You can get an annulment, from what I understand, if you are not financially responsible.
That's right. Financial responsibility, that's right.
If you get married before you're 21 years old, you're virtually assured of an annulment because you're immature. Even though the official age in canon law for someone to get married is 16 for boys and 14 for girls. And so when 18-year-olds marry, it's virtually presumed that they are incapable of marrying. There are very few couples now who are refused, if any.
You know, many of our viewers would say, oh, you're just making that up. Well, I can prove this. There's an article I have from the Cleveland Diocesan newspaper, and I'll quote it directly. Cases of due competence are those in which one or both parties are unable to live up to the marriage vows because of psychological dysfunction, addiction, or even chronic financial irresponsibility. In fact, it said this, and I'd like to get your reaction. The good news for those seeking annulments is that since the late 60s, there are relatively easy paths to annulment. In the Cleveland Diocese, Father Fedor says that 90 to 95% of the petitions for annulment are accepted for a decision by the tribunal, and a similar percentage of the accepted cases receive a favorable verdict. What this means is that if you want an annulment badly enough, your chances of receiving one today are extraordinarily high. Father Kelly, Father Morochka.
What we're concerned about here is fraud. Father Sanborn just stated there are legitimate reasons for granting an annulment. If you can prove that there was some obstacle that impeded two people from getting married, the Church can declare an annulment. It is clear from that article and what others have stated in other dioceses that what the tribunals are granting are, in fact, Catholic divorces. Saying that all of us, all of the priests here, I'm sure, have come across in our apostolate couples that have been married 20, 30 years, and for one reason or the other, a divorce happened, and one spouse met another party and wanted to attempt a second marriage, and applied for an annulment after 25 years marriage and several children, and was granted that annulment.
See, a divorce is a breakup of a marriage that is perceived to be existing. And the civil government grants divorces, which the Catholic Church traditionally wouldn't even recognize. An annulment is a declaration that there was never a marriage because of some intrinsic problem. So when the diocesan tribunal is saying all of these people, in fact, are never married, and 95% of those who apply are given annulments, who's married? Who out there is married? If you can, I mean, if your visa goes a little high, or if you get behind on your payments, according to that, then you can go get an annulment. Or maybe you have to say, well, maybe we're not married because I'm financially irresponsible. I mean, this is an absurdity. This is an insanity. I mean, that normal people would take this seriously, and especially people in Roman collars.
I think the point that Father Morochka made, however, is a very significant point. That, I mean, it's humorous in some ways, but it's very, very significant that what is happening, what is being perpetrated on Catholic people in the United States is a fraud, a deliberate, willful, conscious fraud. And the fraud consists in this. The Catholic people are being told by the American bishops and by the chancellors of the dioceses and by the parish priests that they are giving these people annulments. They are lying to the people. They're giving divorces to the people. And instead of being honest about it and saying to them, look, we reject the teaching of the Catholic Church on the indissolubility of marriage. We reject that teaching. We believe in divorce. We reject what Christ said. We're going to grant the divorce to you, and you can come back again if you'd like. They would be honest. But they are deceiving the people, pretending to the people that they are giving them an annulment when they're giving a divorce. And it's typical of the new religion. That is the problem with the new religion. The people are told that the new Mass they go to is the same as the old Mass translated into English. They are told that the so-called sacrament of reconciliation is really the sacrament of penance. They are even being deceived with regard to the ordinations and consecrations of the new church, because they have changed the essential words necessary, for example, to make a bishop and to make a priest, words which were declared and defined by Pope Pius XII. So that's, in my opinion, that's the root of the problem, that the new church, this new religion, is deceiving the Catholic people into thinking that it is still Catholic.
Back in the old days, Julius, every parish priest would do a marriage investigation, which we all do here. to determine if two people who are seeking to get married were free to marry one another. And after careful instruction, the parish priest would proceed with the marriage. And it's always been the teaching of the church that when two people approach the altar of God and they get married, they are married until death do they part. St. Augustine said that marriage is like an iron chain that links two people together. He said it would be easier for the soul to depart from the body than for husband to leave wife. It's a quote from St. Augustine.
So you can see then that the diocesan tribunals are involved, in my opinion, in a heinous crime. They are destroying families. That's what they are doing. They are going into families and destroying the bond which is the foundation of the family. They are saying to people who are married for 25 years, oh, you were never married. You were never married at all. I mean, just as an example. And they're saying this to many thousands, tens of thousands of people every year. I mean, 50,000 in 1 year, going into families and destroying families. Because it is just unbelievable that there are that many phony or invalid marriages taking place. That to me is just, I mean, it's just an absurdity, as I said. And they are, in my opinion, involved in destroying family life.
Well, you know what's a question I have for them is they're quick to grant an annulment, but even quicker to say that, oh, just because there's annulment, this doesn't mean that the children are illegitimate. Is that true?
Well, they're saying, in fact, that article you have there says that the children of every marriage are legitimate. That's exactly what that article says. But that's that Orwellian new thing where you can embrace contradictions at the same time. I remember when I was in the seminary, we had a professor of dogmatic theology, in fact, and this is after the changes took place, who got up in front of the class and said to the students, he said, we have a new truth. And the new truth is a thing can be true and false at the same time in the same way. This is a new truth. This is a dynamic way of thinking. And that poison, which is really a revolt against God and reality itself, it is in the practical order translated into these practices. They say, we have changed nothing. And in fact, they've changed everything. These people were never married, but all of these children are legitimate.
I mean, how would you feel if your parents, if you found out that your parents had never been married, say because your mother was financially irresponsible? How would you feel if you found that out today? I mean, would you feel good about yourself and about your whole family situation?
I'd feel illegitimate.
Right. I mean, it's just...
it's absurd.
Yeah.
You know, you're watching what Catholics believe, and we're back to the issue of annulments. It says in this diocesan newspaper, of course, the watershed event was Vatican II. It said, the shift in the Church's judgment as to what is or is not a valid sacramental union began in the main with Vatican Council II, of course, and was further developed after that. My question is this. Say there's two Protestants. The Catholic Church assumes that two Protestants who are married have a valid marriage, and they must get an annulment, say, if they're divorced and they claim they were never married and one wants to marry a Catholic. Well, very often now I will hear a new priest say, well, you see, we've grown. We now know that much more goes into a marriage than we previously thought possible, and that we know more about psychology than we previously knew before. Therefore, this is very much justified.
I would say that that type of growth is cancer. I mean, there's a growth that's good and there's a growth that's utterly and completely destructive. Mm-hmm. That is like saying that we have a new view of health, that sickness is good.
It's to say that it is impossible for two human beings to commit themselves to each other for life. That is essentially it. That it's virtually impossible for that type of consent to take place. That's typical of the whole new religion. There are no absolutes. There is never anything that is permanent and absolute and unchanging. Everything is relative. Their dogmas are relative. They change with the times. Their morals are relative. They change with time and circumstances. And their marriages are relative. If things don't go well, you go down to the rectory and you start the annulment process. Nothing is forever. It's all just changes with the times.
It's interesting that you mention that, because it continues in this article. It says, another member of the tribunal, Father Gary Gresco, says, if your marriage was radically defective, you have a right to have that declared so you can get into a better marriage. People still see annulments as a favor. We don't see them as a favor. They are a right.
This whole new annulment attitude also makes a mockery of those noble Catholics years ago who were told, even if their husbands or their wives left them through no fault of their own, they were told correctly by the parish priest, you must live out your life alone, because in the eyes of God you are still married. Whether it is your fault or not that your spouse has left you or that you are separated, you are still married. And there were many, many good souls who lived their whole lives out in preparation for eternal salvation, faithful to their original marriage vows. For the new church to come along and say what they're saying now is just, it makes a mockery of their whole sacrifice. Some people had to go their whole lives from their 20s on, perhaps with children, women with children, because their husbands left them. They could not marry. They could not do anything. They couldn't even think a thought about marrying or be seen with another man.
What's implicit in all of this is a denial of an afterlife. It seems that we're here to enjoy life to the fullest, and that's what the church is here, to make us happy in this world. Father Kelly.
It's also a denial, as Father Sanborn said, of the capacity of a human being baptized and strengthened by grace to make a commitment to another human being for the rest of their lives. And it's also in complete contradiction to the very words that are used even at probably most new marriages. They say, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death. The reason they say those words is because every marriage, to one degree or another, goes through a certain amount of hardship and difficulty. Some have to exercise heroic virtue. But that is the way they save their souls. That is their state in life. That is their mission given to them by God. And it is just a fact of life, because of original sin, that in this life we must suffer. We must share in the cross of Christ. As St. Paul said, he said, we must fill up in our flesh what is lacking of the sufferings of Christ. And what is lacking of the sufferings of Christ would be our participation in those sufferings.
I think it's also true that those who have received these phony annulments know in the depths of their hearts that they are phony. They know what they said before the altar of God and before the priest, that until death do they part. And when they go through their, because the love bug has gotten them, you know, for another man or another woman, whatever it should be, and they go on through this whole phony process, they, just like Henry VIII knew that his annulment was phony, they know it's phony too, and I think they will be judged severely by God for that.
In fact, in one of the missions in a different state, I came across a particular gentleman that came to the Mass for the first time, and talked to him after Mass. He said he was married in 1947. And then when the Korean War came along, he was drafted and went over to the war. His wife met another gentleman and took off. He was the innocent party. Of course, a divorce ensued, and he remained celibate from 1951 until 1977. And he applied for an annulment in the late 70s and was granted it in 1980 and attempted a second marriage after all of that time. And when I confronted him and I told him, and I says, well, look, you know, this is the traditional teaching of the church, I could see in his eyes that in his heart of hearts, he knew that the original marriage contract that he entered into in 1947 was a true and valid Christian marriage. And he was almost in tears. But out of Christian charity, I had to tell him that you cannot receive the sacraments here until you either separate from the second one or leave her or whatever, you know. But he was practically in tears. But in his heart of hearts, he knew, I think, that he was really married.
You know, I have an interesting observation, too. John Paul II in the early 80s or whenever expressed that it looks like we're getting too many annulments. And then the Bishop of Cleveland said that the number of annulments being granted in our diocese is due to a large extent to the concern of parish priests and those who work with them for people's spiritual welfare and reconciliation with the Church. Well, my own brother applied for annulment. And after a while, he said, look, this is a joke. I know I'm married. I'm not even going to go through it. So he got a letter from the diocesan tribunal saying, look, if you don't send us more information, we're not going to be able to go through the annulment proceedings. So he stopped. He didn't send them anything. 6 months later, he receives a letter, congratulations, you have an annulment. So this is the kind of concern. But, you know, this article, I'd like to get your reaction on this. Speaking of a contrary to the heroic virtue, says, speaking of patterns throughout the country, Zwack relates, it is no secret that many priests today practically counsel high-risk couples to marry outside the church, thus preserving annulment grounds if they obtain a civil divorce. If the marriage works out, the couple can always regularize it with the church. If some priests do in fact do that, they are guilty of a loophole mentality frowned on by the teaching church. The same judgment has sometimes been imposed on the internal forum, solution, etc. What do you think of this?
I think it's an anti-church. I don't even think it's a church. It's functioning in such a way where it takes only this life into consideration. We were made for God. God made us for himself. Our Lord Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. He gave us the church, gave us the sacraments, gave us the truth, gave us the moral law to abide by so that we might save our souls. Time passes and everyone dies. And the only thing that matters on Judgment Day is, did I die in a state of sanctifying grace or not? And these priests and these bishops will have some long list of crimes to answer for. And they will not be able to get out of it either. Not that I'm judging anyone individually, but they will not be able to get out of the strictest of judgments on the basis that everybody else was doing it.
You know, what's surprising to me is that 10 years ago, they would have been afraid to write an article like this because people would have thought something's really wrong in the church. But we've come so far that this isn't a secret document. This is the diocesan newspaper of Cleveland where this was. Let me ask you this. One quote is as follows. In other words, if you have a moral certainty that your marriage was invalid, but for some reason are unable to prove that in a tribunal case, if you can convince a sympathetic priest of the authenticity of your conviction, he may restore you to full communion in the church.
There's a lot of churches that the law favors the marriage until the contrary can be proved. And you cannot convince a priest or a tribunal that you are free to marry. In fact, in the old days, they would not take your testimony. They would not allow you to be a witness to testify because it's a negative proof. And that because people lie. Anybody could come up and say, I really didn't have the intention, I was too young, and cry the blues to you and seek an annulment. And well, that's precisely what's happening.
Father Sam?
No. Well, the reason that is absolutely absurd is because the public life of the church must be governed by certain laws and certain procedures and certain requirements of proof. It is conceivable, I mean, it is within the realm of possibility that a person knows that when they got married, they withheld the intention to get married and therefore their marriage was invalid. That is conceivable, but that they could not prove it in the external forum. But the principle that must be followed, obviously, is that the standards established by the church for that person to be able to prove that the marriage was invalid must be adhered to for the sake of the common good.
Let me ask you a closing question. What does this whole situation tell us about the argument that nothing essential has been changed since Vatican II?
I think what you said is very appropriate, that if a person could stop and think and sit back and observe what went on in the church in 1940 and what goes on today, if they cannot see that there is a radical, dramatic, and essential change, they are either blind or dead.
Father Sanborn.
No, and to take a statistic where you have a 15,000% increase, 15,000%, and say, well, there's nothing essentially different about the procedure and attitudes, you know, and that's 1968. Now, that's over 1968. That's after the council already. So there's a 15,000% increase. I mean, yeah, what can you say to a person who's... that's the big lie of the century. It's the big lie. That's all it is.
You've been watching...